So welcome back. This is the second video I'm doing on the topic of tracking and settings in MIDI Guitar 3 that are related to the perceived tracking. That is a notion that I want to talk about a little. The idea of perceived tracking is closely related to the difference between just talking about latency and talking about round-trip latency. In the case of round-trip latency, we talk about everything that goes on from the time that you pick a note on your guitar until it comes back to you via the monitors and all this stuff that has gone on in the system between. So we have a lot of conversions from audio to digital and that into MIDI and then back again from digital to audio and then coming back to me via my monitors. So that would be the whole signal chain for the round-trip latency to take place. This will obviously be very different from that little value that you look at in the specs when you're checking for how fast is this software doing its conversion. So you get some value from, say, 2.9 milliseconds to 7 milliseconds. It really doesn't matter because that's not what you're going to judge it on. This is important in some way, but it's only one part of the whole chain. The advice that I'm going to give you here today is on settings related to bends, pitch bend ranges, to MIDI versus MPE settings, and more importantly, dynamics, because the bends have a really important role in representing the instrument that you're playing. So if you're playing an instrument and it comes back to you as non-responsive in terms of how it's bending in relation to how you're bending on your guitar, you're going to feel that this is probably down to the tracking or something like this. You might realize that it's down to the settings, but if you don't know how to do anything about it, you don't know. The other part is, of course, the dynamics. So dynamics is really important for this stuff that goes on when you're changing between a pick and other fingers. So hybrid picking, or if you're tapping notes. If you're not setting up your dynamics correctly, you might get dropouts from when you're switching from pick to going into tapping a note or something like this. And again, it might feel like a tracker problem, but it really isn't. The settings that I'm going to look at are the settings on the actual modules for the instruments that you open in MIDI Guitar 3. And I'm also going to look at the dynamics modules 3 settings and how they relate to the perceived tracking in the end. Let's assume this is the first time you've ever come across MIDI Guitar 3 and try to open an instrument inside of it. We're going to go with a contact instrument. Here's how it looks when I'm clicking on a slot to open an instrument. I'm choosing from the list of instruments that I have inside of MIDI Guitar 3. As soon as you've installed MIDI Guitar 3, it's going to scan your computer for your existing third-party instruments, and it's going to add those to the already existing instruments coming with MIDI Guitar 3. First setting you need to check when you're opening a new instrument is, am I going to use it as an MPE instrument or is it a MIDI 1.0 legacy instrument? There's a fundamental difference in the way that these instruments receive information or are expecting information. A MIDI 1.0 instrument is expecting information on one channel at a time, whereas an MPE instrument is able to receive information on multiple channels at a time, and also with accompanying pitch information and modulation information for CC74. So MPE can be described as sending every note with its own pitch wheel information and mod wheel information bundled together. So different kinds of controllers will make different kinds of uses of these channels. Say the Rolly Seaboard, for instance, makes use of all the remaining 15 channels, excluding the global channel that isn't used for voice messages per se. Whereas MIDI Guitar is only making use of 6 channels, MIDI channels 2 to 7 for this. If you're sending information as if it's an MPE instrument and the instrument actually only listens to channel 1, for instance, as an old school instrument would be, you're not going to hear anything. Here's a quick example of what can go wrong if you don't pay any attention to whether or not this is an MPE instrument or a traditional MIDI 1.0 instrument. Here I have the MIDI Guitar UI open again. I have nothing loaded, so I'm choosing an instrument and I'm going for UVI's workstation. Here is that workstation. I'm leaving this as an MP instrument for now. Opening up, I have the acoustic samples free collection here. I'm using the contrabass. And to see whether or not I have anything coming into MIDI guitar, there should be some light beams around this guitar if I have a sound coming in. And you see that it is, but you obviously don't hear anything. Let's go to the mixer part. Here's the mixer, and we can see that this fader, which has the same color as this chain that I'm working in, is obviously up, so I should hear something. It also indicates down here that something happens and I have a signal in, but I don't have any sound. In this case, it is due to the fact that I haven't cared anything about this MP setting versus what this instrument is expecting. For this particular instrument, it says A1 here, and that means that this instrument is listening to or expecting its information on MIDI channel 1. If I click here, I can see that, okay, I have an omni setting, which would mean that it could listen to anything on any channel, or I can be very specific and say that I want it to listen on any of these channels. I'm going to leave it at 1 and change this into a MIDI 1.0 legacy setting, which would mean, as I told you before, that MIDI guitar is sending all the information on MIDI channel 1 to begin with. That would mean that you should hear something now. You do, but you also hear maybe that the band range could be off. So I'm changing it to band range 2, which is one of the more classical settings for band range for any sort of legacy instruments. So this was the solution in this case. The instrument was expecting information on MIDI channel 1, but since I had it set to MIDI MPE, which is the default setting for MIDI guitar, it got all the information on MIDI channels 2 to 7, and therefore you heard nothing. So a quick word about these MIDI 1.0 multi-channel settings. Traditionally, these would be used in old school MIDI for multi-timbral instruments, perhaps with a common controller for pitch and stuff like this. But that's not how it's used here. If you use this MIDI 1.0 multi-channel setting here, the instrument will receive the per note, per channel pitch band information, just as it does with the MP setting. The only real difference is it will not receive any CC74, as far as I know. And so for the next setting, that is the channel pressure versus the Aftertouch versus the no pressure. It's perhaps not as critical a choice as is the MIDI 1.0 legacy versus the MP. You're hardly getting into trouble by not choosing anything else than the channel pressure, so you can safely leave it there. But in those cases where you actually have an instrument that has something connected to Aftertouch or channel pressure that you don't like. And I have this example with a guitar that has vibrato connected to its Aftertouch. And since I almost never want any extra vibratos on any instruments, I struggled a bit before I understood that they've connected this to Aftertouch or channel pressure. But this happened when I opened up this particular instrument in Contact. I'm not changing MIDI MPE here, and I'm not doing anything to channel pressure. I've already set the band range to 2 because I know that this instrument has a band range of 2. Here is that Contact container, and here is the instrument. It's Sketch Samples D-hole guitar. You hear straight away. And this is interesting because there's no knob or button in the UI that helps me turn this vibrato off if I don't want it. I had to go to the manual, and there I found these 2 ways to add vibrato if I wanted to. And that way I also learned how to get rid of that particular vibrato if I didn't want it. Okay, they've assigned this to the Aftertouch, in this case the channel pressure here. So put this to no pressure. And you hear right now a nice sounding guitar without that kind of strange vibrato. With the channel pressure on, with no pressure. It's a really nice sounding guitar. If you come across an instrument where you know that they've assigned something to Aftertouch that you really don't care for, the easiest way to get rid of that is actually to go and click no pressure for that. But beware, channel pressure is one of the more fundamental messages that your instrument can receive, especially for dynamic purposes. So if there's nothing explicitly bugging you, you really shouldn't turn that off. The next segment in this video is all about pitch bend range and the bend ranges settings that you find on your instruments modules in MIDI Guitar 3. And I'm going to give you 3 advice here to begin with, and then we'll go on and explain why these are important. So the first one being match your pitch bend ranges. This is also the advice you get on all of these modules. You'll see that it says important set to match whatever is set inside the synth. The next advice I have here is particularly for guitar players. Set your pitch bend ranges the same value both up and down. For those of us who has some floating trems on our guitars, we can do pitch bends both up and down. We want the instrument to follow that kind of pitch dives as well. The third advice I have here is to set your instrument to the largest achievable pitch bend range it allows for. And this is so that we can use more or most of our guitar neck for slides, or if you have a fretless instrument, you can use it for that. But let's begin with the first advice that I gave you, to match the pitch bend ranges. Most of the synths and the virtual instruments that you're going to play have the ability to have their notes or their pitches bent up and down. Traditionally, you would probably use something like a pitch wheel on your keyboard for this. But then the question becomes, what does pitch bend range even mean? Different synths use different kinds of pitch bend ranges. Some synths even use different kinds of pitch bend ranges for pitch up and pitch down, and we're going to look at that. But to make it easier for us, I'm going to use another preset with another setting, up to and down to. So let's use our pitch wheel on our keyboard for this. If you take it from the neutral position and push it all the way up, you know that this particular patch in this synth allows for a pitch bend of 2 semitones, also of 2 semitones down. Now, what does this mean for guitar? Remember how I told you that we have one of these pitch wheels per note on our guitar? This means that any note that you're trying to manipulate in any way is going to stop being bent after 2 semitones. You can't bend or manipulate the pitch on any note with this setting more than 2 semitones. And I'm using the term manipulating pitch so that you don't think of this pitch bending stuff only in terms of bending notes on your guitar neck with traditional means. You could just as well use something like this and slide a note up the neck. And if you've limited yourselves to a pitch bend range of 2, the only thing that will happen is that the note will stop following your slide after 2 semitones. Here's the practical application of the other advice I gave you. If you use the maximum pitch bend range available in any particular synth, I know it's 48 in this particular synth, and that's double the range of any guitar neck. If you use something like 24 or 48 for a pitch bend range, you're good to go. You can use a slide for the full length of your neck on your guitar. And the great thing is that the MPE standard has a pitch bend range of 48. So for our purposes, it works perfectly for us. If you want to know what happens if you don't match the pitch bend range on the module with the pitch bend range on the synth. This is what happens. Let's start with an example where I have a pitch bend range of 48 in the Diva module in MIDI Guitar 3, but inside Diva itself, I'm using 2 up and 2 down. Well, that's kind of a letdown, nothing happens. So I'm using 2 here, but I'm going to 48 here for both up and down. You can probably see for yourselves how somebody that tries this software and doesn't pay attention to these settings might get the idea that there's something wrong with the tracking, it really doesn't track my bends at all, or you get these kind of wayward bends that doesn't correspond at all to what I'm doing. But if you follow the 3 pieces of advice that I gave you in the beginning here, regarding this advice on symmetry that I also had, since you only have 1 setting in MIDI Guitar 3 for pitch bend range, if you don't use the same values for both up and down in the synth, you will get this kind of asymmetry and also some kind of weirdness following that. So that's the obvious answer to why I'm giving this particular piece of advice. So let's move on and get started with this dynamics module, because I think this is one of the unsung heroes of MIDI Guitar 3, and if you look closely and have worked with MIDI Guitar 2, you'll see some recurring themes here. When I'm lazy, I'm talking about this as a dynamic sculpting tool, but once you start to look inside of the dynamics module, you realize quite quickly that this is more like 3 distinctly different tools that we're talking about. From top to bottom, we have a MIDI compressor, we have a hold pressure button, and we have a tone button. All of these are quite different in what they do. So let's start with the MIDI compression. If you're playing a virtual instrument that has a very wide dynamic range, a lot of notes in the softer parts of the instrument and also in the louder parts of the instrument, this could be a great thing, you might think, but you might also need to consider that this kind of dynamic distribution is catered towards keyboards or piano players, because it's way easier for a keyboard player to control velocities with hitting a key than it is for us as guitar players to control the velocities with the picking of a note or the plucking of a note. So as a guitar player, it's really hard to control the dynamics if I have to resort to stuff like really hitting the strings hard or just nudge the strings as I'm playing. But it's way easier to control the dynamics with a really light touch, so that the difference between picking a note and plucking a note or even hammering on a note isn't really all that obvious. Otherwise, if you have this very wide dynamic range, it's going to react differently to how you pick a note with your pick and how you tap a note, because of the differences in the structure of what you're using to sort of get this note going. And the solution to this is to use some sort of MIDI compression to push all the dynamic materials towards the middle so that it will be easier to access for a guitar player with a really light touch. There are 2 ways, and I usually combine these. You go into the instrument and you make adjustments to the sensitivity settings and perhaps the dynamic settings in the instruments. And you also use the dynamics module compression button. Let's go into one instrument and I'll show you what I mean. So if you want to shape the way that an instrument dynamically responds to your input, these are, in this case, the 2 places I would go for. This is the velocity curve, and that's essentially a mapping between your incoming velocities as opposed to the outgoing velocities. So 127 for 127 and 0 for 0. If I want it to be a bit steeper, I can do stuff like this. I can say that my incoming 14 is to be represented by an outgoing of 34, and so on. I can shape this whole curve a bit. This will render it a bit louder in terms of output. That's not all. Here is the dynamics fader. And this is also what I would use to narrow the dynamic range that I was talking about earlier. So before we go into the inner workings of how the MIDI compressor and the dynamics module actually work, let's first recognize that both strike and pressure are involved here. Any settings you've done to strike or pressure for any instrument on any chain will be affected. So the main idea with the compressor in the dynamics module is to provide a dynamic framework for an instrument to work in. You sort of take away a bit of the wayward highest dynamics and also of the softest dynamics. So you give it a place in the middle where it's consistent and trustworthy, and where you know that anything you play will be heard. I'm often using compressor on bass, for instance. It's an easy way for me to push an instrument's dynamics into a place that I have control over. Hold pressure. This is a new thing for MIDI Guitar 3. And might I say it, it's a really interesting thing as well. Unlike the compressor, this isn't really applicable to both strike and pressure. This is more like only pressure. But what it does is it keeps the pressure up for way longer than we're used to. We're kind of used to the restriction of having the strings vibration providing the dynamic framework for whatever we're trying to control. So if I'm playing a synth, it's gonna sound a little bit like a guitar anyway, since if I pick a note on my guitar, I will have this high transient in the beginning and the tapering out as the string stops vibrating, and I can keep the note on the synth ringing for as long as I can keep my string vibrating. So for the longest time, we've been kind of torn between either having to sound like a guitar somewhat playing our instruments, or using something like an external controller, breath controller, expression pedal or something to modulate or to affect the aftertouch or pressure if we want to control any instrument trying to emulate other instruments, for instance. That was then. This is now. Now we have stuff like infinite sustain with MIDI guitar. And you also have this. This is another way of keeping the pressure up without having to step on any pedals or blow into any breath controllers. For any instrument that has anything to gain from having anything else than guitar-like dynamics that we get from Aftertouch traditionally, you might want to try this. I would say the expression on a SWAM instrument, here's the tool for that. So just to make this abundantly clear, I'm not using any kinds of controllers. I'm just using the SWAM instrument as is, with the C-board preset, which is a MP preset, and you'll see here that I have the MPE setting, channel pressure, and band range 48, which is the standard for any sort of MP instrument. So the only thing that I want to demonstrate here is the difference that the hold pressure here does for playability when it comes to an instrument like this SWAM soprano. Keep an eye on the pressure button here and the light halo around it. This is the traditional guitar dynamics. It is not bad by any means, but if you want to play more like a saxophone player, you might not want this steep dive directly from having triggered the note every time. So what the hold pressure does is it keeps the pressure up for way longer, and this is what's going to make all the difference if you want to sound like a saxophone player. So I'm going to crank this up to 100 and listen to this instead. It's not like you lose any dynamics or anything. This is just a way for it to keep more stable once you've triggered the notes. Now, the last tool in our dynamics toolbox, the tone button or the tone knob. It is a setting for dynamic balance or imbalance rather. If you feel that your higher strings or your thinner strings aren't sounding as much as your lower strings, so that the lower strings perhaps are overpowering the thinner strings, you turn the tone knob from its center position in the middle slightly towards the right. So you get more dynamic emphasis on the thinner strings as opposed to the lower end. And of course the opposite. If you think that your lower strings are kind of weak, whereas your higher strings sound way too much, you can rectify this by moving the tone knob counterclockwise. Of course, we're not talking about strings really here. We're talking about the pitches belonging to these strings and these regions of your instrument. But say that you're moving along with a chord progression and you consistently feel that the lower pitches belonging to these chords are triggering another velocity layer than the higher part of the same chords. Then it's time to go in and use this tool perhaps. If you shift the dynamic balance a bit, you might get all the notes playing the same velocity layers, and this could be important for the overall feel of how these instruments sound. But remember, don't overdo stuff. There's no need to turn it all the way to the right or all the way to the left. This is a fine tuner for the dynamic imbalances rather than anything else. If you've seen both of the videos I've done on this notion of perceived tracking and all the stuff that goes into this, thank you and congratulations. You're now in the best position ever to start experimenting with the MIDI Guitar 3 software. You don't need to make all the mistakes that at least I have done. So like, subscribe and notification bell, you know, all that stuff. I really hope you have some use for the tips and advice I have in these two videos. And I also hope to see you soon, because that means I have something interesting to tell you. But until then, have a great time and bye.